Okay, so I believe we are now live. And as our attendees join, the webinar will also begin, and it is also recording. Excellent. So welcome, everyone. My name is Ollie Sweet. I sit on the board of the AQR, and I'm here to welcome you to this webinar, welcome you to Asad and Jennifer. This is the fourth in our Eyes Wide Open series, which has been about how we, the Eyes Wide Open series is about addressing some of the biggest issues that we've got in qualitative research and how we go about sort of addressing them. And we are using this series of Eyes Wide Open to look at the diversity and inclusion challenge that we face in qualitative research. And really, I think the webinars so far have been excellent at unpacking what those issues really are. And I have to say that having done a quick chat with both Asad and Jennifer yesterday, this one definitely takes us another step further. So this one is looking at colourism and the issues that we have around that. And in this format, this format we have for Eyes Wide Open, Asad will be interviewing Jennifer as part of it, and Jennifer will be giving her presentation and her thoughts with questions from Asad. So that is our webinar for today. In previous webinars, we've had a wonderful level of chat, so please do use the chat function in this webinar. The talk between Asad and Jennifer will go on for about half an hour plus, and I want you to put your comments, your thoughts, your questions into the chat as you go. Rather than waiting to the end, you might have forgotten what your question is or what your idea is. And when you do, please address it to all panelists and attendees. That way other people can see the debate developing as well. But that's plenty from me. I'm going to hand over to Asad and Jennifer for this webinar. Thank you.
Thanks Ollie. Thanks so much, Ollie. So I'm Asad Dhunna. I'm the CEO and founder of a consultancy called the Unmistakeables. We specialize on inside-out inclusion. So we work with organizations to become more culturally confident and to create the inclusive cultures that you need in order to create more inclusive campaigns. And that's all underpinned by data and insights. I'm super excited to be joined by Dr. Jennifer Simon. I was just looking at the official job title, which is Senior Semiotician. I think I've said that right, a crowd DNA. But Jennifer, did you want to give a short intro to who you are, and then I'll ask my first question?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Jennifer Simon. So I'm a senior consultant at Crowd DNA in the science unit, and specializing in semiotics. And essentially, we are a science unit, and we specialize in trends, semiotics, social listening. So all of the kind of like the cultural insight that involves kind of like unconscious understandings of the human condition, that's what we specialize in. But we also do qualitative research and quantitative research as well.
Great. So Jennifer, I guess my first question, and you haven't really covered it yet, but I'd love to hear a bit more about your upbringing and how that has influenced your career and what you do today.
Yeah, definitely. So I like to tell people that I'm a third culture kid, right? I was born in the US, but I grew up in the Caribbean and the UK, and then I went back to the US when I was older. So my sense of home is essentially everywhere but nowhere. So when anyone asks me that "where are you from" question, it's really difficult for me to answer. And I also went to mainly international schools. So I was used to straddling and living in several cultures. And this made me very attuned to, cultural nuances and idiosyncrasies. And I was obviously doing a lot of code switching there. But you think that my path to a cultural insight career was really straightforward, but it wasn't. I actually started working in international development in the US. And what was interesting is when I was there, I didn't see a lot of people that looked like me. International development, even though we were advising on several countries' local policies. So this is both mostly in developing nations. So what was really interesting for me was to find out why this was the case. Why was there this disparity? as it relates to people, minority ethnic people that weren't in international development. And then I decided to go to grad school, and I did a master's in sociology. So I looked at those kind of race and class disparities in university study abroad programs in the US, and looking at solutions on how to solve that using qualitative research. But I stayed on to do my PhD in sociology in Atlanta, and that's where I first encountered semiotics. And that was, during my program, I fell in love with it. And when you're doing a PhD, no one tells you that there's life outside of academia. But semiotics was a really insightful tool that could be used to solve, real world business problems. And its methodology is grounded in culture, and it really clicked for me. So I decided, to pursue a career in commercial semiotics, and the rest is history. And here I am. And Asad, I think you're on mute.
Classic. So there's probably a few things that you're going to cover in your presentation, and things like code switching and how that has worked. But I guess the biggest question that I had when I found out that we'd be speaking is what is semiotics? Yeah.
So good question. So semiotics, in a nutshell, it's a research method that decodes consumers' culture, right? So that's popular culture, fashion, art, anything that's made by humans. And we're doing that in order to understand what unconsciously shapes and motivates decision-making and behaviors. And we're tracking how those consumer beliefs and decision-making will change as culture changes over time, right? So I think an important thing to understand is that traditional consumer feedback or qualitative research, we talk to consumers and we ask about, their opinions and preferences. But semiotics, what it does, it investigates how and why people have those opinions and beliefs in the first place. So it's essentially understanding the culture that created those beliefs and how those values and beliefs change over time as culture changes. So we essentially identify, cultural codes, which are comprised of kind of visual and linguistic cues and symbols in the world around us to help us understand this. And so, it reveals, semiotics is a really good tool to reveal why consumers unconsciously think the way they do, and it helps brands to understand how they can be more meaningful to consumers in a more culturally relevant way in the dynamic world that we're living in.
Great. Okay. Well, I believe you have a presentation for us that I'm very lucky to get a bit of a sneak peek yesterday. So should we head there, Jennifer, and then I'm sure people will have questions as we go along, and I've got some as well that we can talk about afterwards.
Definitely. Okay. So let me share my screen. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So what I'll do is I'll take you through my presentation, which will focus on understanding this overlooked bias, which is the semiotics of colorism in advertising. And the reason why colorism is called an overlooked or a silent bias is because it's a topic that's often ignored in D&I conversations in marketing and in advertising, but it's a vital topic to understand and address. And this is because it affects a large portion of your consumer market. It influences the kind of products you put out, and it has significant implications for the kind of insights we produce as researchers. And before we get into the semiotic analysis, there's some brief background slides to understand what exactly a colorism is. And it's a term that was introduced by the Pulitzer Prize winning author Alice Walker, and it's defined as a form of prejudice that places higher value on people with lighter skin. And I think what's important to note is that it can occur among people in the same racial group and between different racial groupings, right? And especially in the West, the roots of colorism is deeply connected to slavery and colonialism. So where stereotypical European aesthetics, such as white skin or straight hair, were overtly promoted as this standard of civilized existence, beauty, wealth, and intelligence. But colorism is not just about how you look. It has material consequences, and it's connected to rights and privileges as a person. So in places like the United States and Latin America, having European bloodline that's pure, meaning not mixed with any other races, you needed to have that in order to own property and vote. And this meant citizenship and wealth generation for those who are considered white. And obviously during slavery, enslavers would typically give preferential treatment to enslaved people with lighter complexions, which resulted in better life chances. So essentially understanding this history is really important to contextualize how it manifests now, right? And it's also important to understand the distinctions between racism and colorism. And I think it's really useful to note that people of different races may have identical or similar skin tones, as this example on the left shows. And the other example, it shows that people who identify as the same race may have different complexions, right? And while colorism is rooted in racism, there is a difference between the two, right? When it comes to racism, it's seen as prejudicial attitudes or discriminatory acts, right? Or both, against people based on actual or perceived racial status. So two people of different races, but identical or similar skin tones can be treated differently. So a South Asian woman who has a lighter skin color, but identifies as Asian can still be mistreated and discriminated against. And for colorism, this is understood essentially as a prejudicial attitude or a discriminatory act against people based on your shade or tone. And two people of the same race, but different skin colors can be treated differently based on those skin tones, right? And I think it's important to understand why colorism is such an important issue for brands and marketing teams. And firstly, it's a worldwide phenomenon. And in effect, it'll help you to become more strategic because, as I said before, it's in both emerging markets and developed markets, right? And these diverse populations around the world are demanding more realistic and accurate representations of themselves and others. So it's crucial to understand these nuances to be culturally relevant for the long term beyond a trend. And another reason why it's important to understand it is that it helps you de-risk your brand in your campaign. And what I mean by that is avoiding cultural missteps, essentially, when you're entering certain markets or marketing to diverse communities. So ultimately, you have more resonant products and experiences rather than something that's likely to offend communities. And I think last but not least, understanding colorism is important because it does have a negative impact on those that are affected by colorism. And studies by WHO and academic research, they reveal that groups that experience colorism tend to have more disparities in life chances compared to those that don't. So this leads to employment opportunities, lower self-esteem, et cetera. And because of this, consumers want to know what side brands land on. When it comes to these issues. Are you perpetuating stereotypes? Or are you challenging them? And what you as a brand essentially stand for. Are you championing or helping marginalized communities? So it's not just talking about this, it's actively showing that you're doing something. And so this is why it's important not to misunderstand this important issue. And so since we need to understand colorism as this vital part of D&I conversation, it's really helpful to examine current trends around diverse representation in ads and in media more general, as this issue of colorism sits within those shifts. So even though recent D&I conversations, I would argue, have increased awareness of the need for diverse representation, there tends to be this narrow view of what diverse representation means. So for instance, because of this lack of understanding, it could be reduced to tokenism or box ticking exercises. But these narrow understanding of diversity are being rigorously challenged by millennials and Gen Zs in particular, because they're demanding more nuanced and intersectional representation from brands. And this will likely increase as they get older. And what I want to do is give you an example of how diverse representation is changing. And so what we're noticing is this shift happening in diverse representation. And this is from this idea of saving communities of color and their causes, or these tokenistic gestures. So this is an example of tokenism in a sense, right? Where this is Pepsi's infamous Kendall Jenner ad speaks to this, where she's portrayed as this hero kind of rescuing a social movement, to this idea of authentically showing the experiences of community of color, which is what the Sainsbury's ad did. And essentially, brands that are aware of that cultural change align and evolve their representation with those changes, as Sainsbury's did. And this ties into the domain of colorism, like within racial categories as well. And that's what I'll take you through now. And so in order to understand this shift in diverse representation, what we'll do is pinpoint how narratives of colorism are being disrupted, and I'll be applying a semiotic lens. And I know I went through what semiotics is, but this is essentially giving you just an overview of semiotics in practice. So it's a powerful tool to do this because we uncover key visual and linguistic cues and codes that underline shifts, cultural shifts, in order to make them apparent and observable. So for instance, let's take a look at a cultural object that we're all familiar with, right? The face mask, and how its meaning has changed due to the pandemic, especially in the West. And so before COVID-19, the face mask was mainly associated with the medical context. It had a primarily functional meaning. It was a barrier of protection for the doctor and the patient, right? Now this meaning has diversified. So in addition to that functional protection, now it's associated with social altruism. So by wearing a mask, you're protecting yourself and the larger community. It's also associated with individuality, and a curated self, where people are encouraged to play with their personal identity and they showcase that to others. And it also communicates this idea of solidarity and endurance. So during the Black Lives Matter movement, wearing a mask became this political canvas to show support, to fight against oppression and the coronavirus simultaneously. So what started off as the face mask being primarily associated with a functional value, it has shifted towards being a functional, emotional, and political value as well, right? And so I'll be using semiotics to take you through some of the dominant, and that is where culture is now, and emergent shifts where culture is moving towards or evolving in representations of Black women in regards to colorism. And the reason why I'm focusing on representations of Black women, particularly dark-skinned Black women, is because firstly, focusing on representation of darker skin tones, and especially as it relates to women, will highlight the nuances of colorism, because it's also highly gendered, and dark-skinned women tend to be the most negatively impacted by it. And secondly, these examples of colorism are definitely more noticeable for me as a Black American woman, and part of ongoing cultural research that I'm doing on this topic. And thirdly, this diverse representation topic has been looked at in recent client projects. And within it, issues of colorism is something that clients will be more interested in knowing about. So it's not to say that women of other races and ethnic groups don't experience colorism, but there are other cultural experts who can tell you even more about that experience than I can. So I'll just take you through these three dominant representations and the emergent spaces of where it's being reimagined. So for the first shift, what I'm noticing is this narrative around dark-skinned Black women in relationships, and where the other partner is also Black, right? So in the dominant space, we find that darker-skinned Black women are coded as absent and undeserving of being socially displayed as a partner. But emergently, these women are part of a varied and personally defined partnership that doesn't require approval from others. And as you can see here, I've identified this narrative of absent display. And this is where darker skinned women's invisibility is visually communicated. And this is through their absence in various representations of male and female pairings. So you can see repetitive visual imagery of darker complexion men that are paired with lighter toned women. So we see this in brands from a variety of categories. So in beauty, in clothing, in super luxury brands like Gucci, and in fast food, and from the United States in this particular example, and in media of all genres. And that ubiquity implies that this is a normal or unquestioned standard of Black female pairings, right, and relationships. And this is where darker skinned Black women are not part of the status quo or standard for a conventional relationship. And notice that they're visuals of attractive women, mostly positioned in front of men. And this communicates this idea that light-skinned women are a prize to be displayed, right? And we also have language that's suggesting a relationship standard to achieve. So for instance, in the Shane example, we have from a clothing brand, couples goals, right? So it's communicating this idea that this type of pairing is aspirational, and by default, other pairings, including those with dark women, are not. And I think it's important to stress that there's nothing wrong with these pairings, but if this is the predominant or only representation of Black relationship, it sends this exclusionary message that these persons, and especially women who are constantly send messages about romantic love being this coveted goal and main aspiration, are left out, and they're undeserving of being in these type of relationships. But emergently, what is happening is that romantic relationships for Black women with darker complexions are varied. And they are in varied partnerships that are personally defined, that doesn't require external validation. So for instance, we see visuals of broad kinds of relationships that darker skinned women belong to in society. So brands such as Parade and The Body Shop, for instance, and we see media representations of that too. And what's interesting is that quote that was in the previous slide, that was from the director, Melina Matsoukas, who directed the movie Queen and Slim. And she made the comment about not seeing darker skinned people fall in love on screen. And that influenced her to make a movie essentially about this. And we see imagery of same-sex couples as well, like in the Bossip example. And this implies that this is an inclusive representation of love and desire for darker toned women. And we see imagery of natural affection, right? We see couples laughing or couples embracing or being playful, which contrasts with the previous slide where the majority of couples were posed. And this communicates this idea of naturalness and comfort. There's genuine warmth and love. This is a relationship not for status or show. And why these are good examples, because essentially darker skinned Black women are being visually represented in these personally defined and varied partnerships of equals, right? And just quickly taking you through the second shift, this is a narrative around darker skinned women and female focused relationships, where we see this narrative around female focused friendships moving from this representation of darker skinned Black women as highly noticeable outliers or invisible towards their presence being normalized, affirmed, and celebrated in the emergent space. So what does this look like? So in the dominant space, what we're seeing is this narrative of darker toned Black women either being a singular spectacle or invisible. And this idea of a spectacle or a token is communicated through visuals of only one darker complexion woman in comms. And she's either positioned in the middle of a lighter group, so like in the Summer Fridays example, or to the side in the Nordstrom example. And this cues a spectacle to be displayed, suggesting this kind of visual difference to focus on. And this essentially implies that darker skinned women are radically different from a norm, right? And this implication is that she's the sole burden of representation in that group. And when you are the only one or the sole burden of representation, you are subject to more eyes on you or more scrutiny, right? And then on the other hand, what we're noticing is this predominance of visuals of lighter skinned Black women or mixed race women. So for instance, in the Victoria's Secret example, and the absence of dark skinned women, especially in a predominantly white group. So for instance, in The Search and the BBC ad. And these visuals essentially communicate this idea that lighter skinned women are the norm or the standard of an acceptable or comfortable form of Blackness as it relates to these friendships, right? So they can seamlessly and naturally blend into a collective group, and thus actually coding darker skinned women as outliers. And finally, this absence of darker complexion women, it evokes this sense of not belonging or purposely ignored, right? Suggesting invisibility or erasure from these spaces. But emergently, what does this look like? And we see darker skinned women's presence being normalized and affirmed. So for instance, we notice this normalization and affirmation in the visual cues, where we see imagery of more than one darker complexion women in diverse groups, so such as the Parade example and the Nubian Skin example to your right, and which suggests a kind of natural belonging, and they're not the sole focus of representation. So coding this kind of normality and freedom to assume your own personality and individuality, right? And we also see imagery of warmth and belonging. So we see imagery of kind acts and gestures. So for instance, in this particular example, this is a still from the Brown Skin Girls music video in which Beyonce is singing to Kelly about her beauty, right? And we also have visuals of individuals in natural poses, right? And it codes this idea of this heartwarming inclusivity and belonging, evoking feelings essentially of ease, reassurance, and security for darker skinned Black women. And we also see language, right, of belonging and affirmation and celebration, So we have language that focuses on highlighting and uplifting darker women and girls. So brown-skinned girls, pang Black girls, and that codes darker skinned women as a source of empowerment, celebration, and inspiration. So rather than a spectacle, their existence is affirmed and supported. Right. And so these emergent representations of friendships for darker skinned Black women are normalizing their presence and affirming and celebrating who they are. And finally, for the last shift, what we're noticing is this narrative about dark-skinned women, Black women, and attractiveness, and especially as it relates to what attractiveness is based on compared to other women. So dominantly, dark-skinned Black women are considered this exotic competition among women, primarily with a male audience in mind. But emergently, they're defined by their nuance and coexistence, so not a competition with other women. And this is especially seen in the makeup and beauty category. So I'll take you through this. And so in the dominant space, we see Black women with darker complexions as represented as exotic rivals. And we see this narrative communicated visually and through image and this idea of competition, especially. So we have imagery of individual women represented on a scale. So where lighter shades are positioned on top or the left of the spectrum and darker shades at the bottom or the far right. And such as an example with pure cosmetics, which is in the middle, and that cues hierarchical ordering or ranking, right? Because in the West, the top is valued higher than the bottom, and the left is the start, right, or the beginning. So it evokes this idea of competition or rivalry against women, where darker skinned women are at the bottom of the leaderboard or in this subordinate position, right? And we also have imagery of a wide variety of lighter skin models compared to darker models, right? So the pure cosmetics example is really evident here, where darker skinned women typically either have 1 or 2 rows at the bottom to represent them, and lighter skin models have several rows at the top. And what this suggests is that lighter skin essentially is the norm, right? There's all this variation, but Black women with darker complexions are kind of the other. And in terms of visually, it communicates this idea of exoticism. So we have value-laden language, especially of darker foundation shades. So they're named after edible sweet items. So if you notice the L'Oreal example in the middle, there's caramel, cocoa, deep chocolate, and mahogany at the bottom. And this codes Black women with darker complexions as commodities, essentially to be consumed and fetishized, essentially a guilty pleasure. And the reason why I included the ice cream ads, and these are from 2004 and 2010, and Haagen-Dazs and Magnum, is because there is this tradition of portraying Black women with darker skin tones as embodying chocolate, right? So this association is used in wider culture, and it's not really specific to the makeup category. And in contrast, notice that the lighter foundation shades, they utilize gentle language. So there's soft beige, right? Rose ivory, and connoting like language that is associated also with preciousness and delicacy. So porcelain and ivory. So coding lighter skinned women as this fragile rarity, right? But emergently, what I'm noticing is that we're moving beyond this hierarchical competition where darker skinned women's attractiveness is positioned as equal to others, but distinctively nuanced, and they're valued for their individual depth and coexistence in this rich and diverse and harmonious community, right? So for instance, we see visually visuals of equality, right? So we have non-hierarchical arrangements of women. So for instance, in the lip bar example, and women are positioned on equal levels. And we have visuals of foundation colors and models, not essentially organized on scales, right? So we see that in the Fenty example and the Flesh example. And this suggests this idea of equal value in attractiveness or beauty, not a competition. And we also have visuals of sociability. So notice models are laughing, they're engaging with one another. They're not in kind of these demarcated boxes, or no, the boxes don't exist. And it communicates this idea of community and harmony and collectivity, suggesting that attractiveness is this collective concept not based on external rankings. And this narrative is also communicated linguistically. And we see references to undertones that are applied to all shades, right? So in the Flesh example, warm peach is applied to both dark and light shades, and all of them and all the shades in between. And it's communicating this depth, that it's a beauty that is multi-layered and nuanced. And we see similar names given to both dark and light shades. So both dark and light shades have cool and neutral undertones, and that highlights similarities rather than stark differences. So essentially what we're seeing here is this challenge, this idea of attractiveness for darker skinned Black women being based on competition and stereotypical tropes of beauty, moving away from that to a more nuanced and collective depth where all women are equally a part of it, right? And essentially, so just to recap the shifts that I took you through. So as it relates to narratives of relationships, we see representations of dark-skinned Black women are shifting from being absent and undeserving of social display to being in varied and self-defined partnerships. And then when it comes to narratives of female friendships, we see representations of darker-skinned women are moving from this duality of being highly noticeable and also highly conspicuous. Conspicuously absent, towards this presence being normalized, affirmed, and celebrated. And finally, when it comes to this narrative of attractiveness, we see representations of darker skinned women that are shifting from this theme of exoticism and exotic rivals with other women towards this idea of attractiveness being based on depth and coexistence with others rather than a competition. And so overall, we can see this challenge in the representation of dark-skinned Black women from being absent and tokenized and stereotyped towards this cultural meaning of darker-skinned women as self-defined, celebrated, and multi-layered. And finally, what I want to end with is what you can do as a brand or marketing team to encourage more future-facing articulations and representations that challenge colorism. And I would agree that diverse representation has come a long way, but there's still more work to do, right? And one way to encourage more future-facing representations is to and challenge colorism is to examine your understanding of diversity, right? So, for instance, ask yourself, how broad is the spectrum of Blackness, for instance, that I'm putting out in my campaigns, or even recruiting as research participants, right? Because there are different dimensions and spectrums of skin tones and experiences and pathways within that Black experience. And I would suggest, secondly, to listen to diverse voices, right? So as semioticians, especially, we notice a lot of emergent trends come from diverse environments, and ensuring that you're actually incorporating those experiences in decision-making is key to maintaining cultural relevance, right? And finally, I would recommend actively broadening what inclusivity means in your representations. And what I mean by that is that we live in a time where younger consumers and millennials and Gen Zs are embracing intersectionality. So how interconnected is your race, class, and skin color, and how that impacts, your life and your reality. And while I focused on colorism to highlight its significance, it's crucial to have this holistic approach and representation in order to be more relevant to these consumers. So it's essentially understanding your consumers, where culture is changing, and cultural insight and semiotics can help you broaden that meaning of inclusivity and action it. Okay, thanks for listening.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Jennifer. I mean, there's so much in there to dissect and analyze and question. And on that point of questions, if people do have them, please put them in the chat or through the Q&A function, and I'll ask. I can already see there's one question in there, so I'm going to come to that really shortly. I guess a question from me, Jennifer, was I think you talked about this movement from dominant to emergent, and you talked about that a lot. And what do you think has changed some of that? Because my mind goes to, it would maybe be easy to say, well, it's because of what happened over the last 12 months, the murder of George Floyd, the resurgence of Black Lives Matter. Or have you seen this shift happening for a longer period of time?
That's really interesting. Okay, so two things on that. One is what we categorize or what we consider dominant and emergent. And I pointed to that in the recommendations, where I did say that as it relates to kind of diverse representations and different marginalized communities, what we see as emergent has been happening in these communities for some time, right? These are stories that we hear and that are told constantly, but it's just that it hasn't, in a sense, bubbled up to the mainstream. So even as semioticians, and I was having a conversation with a colleague, how we categorize dominant emergent is really interesting. But essentially, to answer your question about if I'm seeing this in terms of if, the Black Lives Matter movement, murder of George Floyd, if that has, I guess, accelerated this. To some degree, yes and no. So as I was saying before, more mainstream brands are doing that a lot more. And so that also begs the question around what are their values and what are the diverse representations that they're actually utilizing? Is it, I guess, to some degree, is it around tokenistic representations, or is this virtue signaling? But at the same time, that is also allowing brands to kind of question this idea around diversity and what it means. Essentially, what I'm noticing though is that brands that tend to be Black owned, well, in this case, they tend to have been doing they have been doing this for a pretty long time. So, and there are newer brands and Black owned brands that have emerged out of kind of like, the Black Lives Matter movement, and they've emerged out of that, and people are supporting them a lot more. So you see these images kind of like bubbling up now and getting into kind of the mainstream. So I would say, yeah, it is. I know it was a long answer to your question, but essentially it's just kind of understanding like what we consider emergent and what we consider dominant. But this has always been happening, but I think now it's kind of kicking up into the mainstream.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jennifer. So there's a couple of questions through. Both of them say great presentation. So I think that would be shared amongst everyone. But the first question is, are there any brands you would say we can learn from when executing ads and marketing? Are there any brands that you feel are going beyond the emergent?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think super emergent spaces. So what I'm seeing, they're about embracing intersectionality. So not just focusing on, say, cisgendered women or able-bodied women or young women or women with perfect skin, for instance. So I'm thinking of a brand I mentioned in the deck, Parade. They are an underwear brand and a topical skincare. Topical skincare. That's another brand that features a lot of non-binary models and models with different skin tones. And I think what is interesting about Parade, what they're doing is they are, in a sense, moving away from tokenism. And what they're doing is highlighting, allowing women to speak their truth. So meaning they're giving them the platform to wear their clothes. So they're utilizing influencers, they're utilizing people from general population, and they are able to also tell their story in a sense. And these are women who run the gamut of, as I said, complexions, and also they feature non-binary women as well. So I think it's more broadening out that representation of what it means to be like a darker skinned Black woman, as well as what these brands are doing in the emergent space. So they could be doing more in terms of including kind of like those groups that tend to be marginalized as well.
Yeah, it's interesting hearing you say that, because I think that point around intersectionality and moving beyond single dimension diversity is the bit where people do struggle, because the structure sometimes of diversity and inclusion is maybe broad brush BAME. People are still trying to get comfortable in saying the word Black. We've just done a research study called Diversity and Confusion, and we found that 40% of people don't feel comfortable to say the term Black in the workplace. And there's a double-edged sword around that, but I think it's about that confidence. So that question was from Keisha Herbert. The next one's from Chloe Fowler. So Chloe asked if there are any consumer categories that are making better inroads. So it strikes Chloe that cosmetics, fashion are doing more, and are also led by people of color often. But what about other categories like food, automotive, finance? Is it harder to do the work there?
Wow, that's a good question. So let's see. I don't think it's harder. And why I say that, and that is a good point that you make, Chloe, around fashion cosmetic. They are led by brands owned by people of color. So most of the, I wouldn't say all of the examples, but most of the emergent examples are brands that are owned by Black women. And so that doesn't mean that if you are in the automotive category or FMCG category, that you have to be Black owned to do this, right? It could mean that you need to bring, if you don't already have diverse voices to the table, and to also understand this issue a lot more. And is there harder work to be done there? Yeah, I don't think it's about harder work. I think it's who you have at the table, listening to your consumers, and then also understanding their motivations and, you know, the wider cultural change, right? So even though, you know, I've showed a lot of examples around cosmetics and fashion, you know, these cultural shifts are broad and they intersect, and it is not necessarily, I guess, restricted to one category. These broader shifts around Gen Zs who are demanding more inclusivity and in their representation. This can also be applied to automotive brands and finance brands and food and drink brands as well. So I think, no, it's not harder, but I think, you know, having the people at the table and understanding your audience is key.
Got you. So Chris asked, and do keep the questions coming in. So Chris asked, what do you think about the rise of mixed race imagery in advertising? Do you think it represents a more emergent narrative around more modern, inclusive, or even higher status imagery?
Wow, that's an interesting question. So let's see. The rise of mixed race imagery now, does it represent the emergence of more modern, more inclusive, and more highlight? Well, I guess so let's see, more modern and more inclusive. So it goes back to what does lightness and what does darkness mean, right? And what it's traditionally associated with. And so if it's connected to this idea that lightness is around status and wealth, because obviously that has been the historical and even contemporary associations, then I think that is a problem. And not to say as I said previously, there's nothing wrong with having mixed race representation in advertising, but if this is the only image that is being reproduced constantly, and that's associated with, you know, inclusivity, for instance, and you have to question that. So even in the presentation that I made, you notice that on the slide around friendships and in the dominant space, we're noticing a lot of mixed race and lighter skinned Black women in those, like, say, predominantly white friendship groups, and question that, like, what does that say about, I guess, comfort, level of comfort, and even the idea of inclusivity? Because to me, that also signifies an idea of kind of whitewashing. So not to say that these mixed race women are acting white, but it's like, what are you comfortable with? And is it more aligned to kind of like, you know, conceptions of, you know, whiteness and what that is associated with, and what does that mean for darker skinned women? So I think we have to be conscious of those associations. I don't, yeah, the rise of mixed race imagery, I think, as I said, you have to look at it not in isolation. You have to look at how even our darker skinned women also being represented there as well. And are they not associated with modernity and inclusivity? What kinds of brands are they more attached to, or what have you? So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I suppose the question that came to me as you were talking was how colorism differs perhaps for men, because I think there's something around beauty standards and,
of course,
what beauty standards look like for women. But do you have any thoughts or any views on how this plays out amongst men, and if there is a similar narrative that emerges?
Interesting. So the the only example I can give for that, so yes, I believe it does exist among men as well. And so let's see, so as it relates to ideas around Blackness and and masculinity. So notice in the presentation, a lot of the images that are about relationships tend to be around very dark-skinned Black men and lighter-skinned women. And it's this idea around darker skin being associated with masculinity and a certain type of masculinity, right? And it's a certain type of masculinity that we associate with kind of aggressiveness and even hostility. And so, you know, it is, and it's not a coincidence that streetwear brands tend to kind of play off that trope, right? So being hard and being, you know, and that is a certain type of masculinity that is, I would say, definitely in Western society coveted, but at the same time has implications for the life chances of darker skinned men, you know, who, if you look at statistics, they're more likely to have higher rates of incarceration, you know, all these kind of things. And so how it plays out, it is an interesting duality, right? So it's kind of like being seen as kind of like in certain segments of the Black community as ideal, but at the same time facing all of, you know, those challenges. And then, but I would preface it by saying that this is also intersectional as it relates to country. So in Jamaica, for instance, so I grew up for a significant part of my life in Jamaica. What we're noticing is that, so skin bleaching or skin lightening is a common practice among women in Jamaica, right? So this is associated with kind of like lighter skin being associated with more desirability, getting a partner, et cetera. But what we're seeing is an uptick in male skin bleaching. And I don't know if you're familiar with the artist Vybz Kartel, and yeah, so he advocates for skin bleaching. And so you have this interesting dynamic happening in, say, you know, in the Caribbean and in Jamaica, for instance, where men are bleaching, because that history of colonialism tends to equate, you know, even masculinity with, you know, lighter skin to some degree. So that means that you are desirable and wealthy and you have status. So, you know, it is a very tricky.
It is. What really strikes me from what you've just said, Jennifer, is the threatening nature of darker skin versus the acceptable nature of masculinity and lighter skin, and how that plays out time and time again, and then the stereotypes embedded. So there's two questions that have come in, so I'm going to ask you those, and I can see we're rapidly about to hit the half an hour mark, so if there are any more questions, do get them in. So the first question was, where are the emergent narratives, often narratives that have already been present in Black communities for a long time?
Yeah.
What do brands need to be mindful of when it comes to cultural appropriation?
Wow, that is, that's a really interesting question. I would say give credit where credit is due. It's sometimes, well, I wouldn't say it's as simple as that, right? But I think it's, because that idea of cultural appropriation, it's highlighting, so this is something that, or, you know, a cultural practice or what have you, or the way you're here, that's something that has been in existence in, say, marginalized communities for from the beginning, but then it has historically been demonized, and now it's being celebrated in the mainstream, but not necessarily on people who are from marginalized communities. So I think it's around being conscious of that, being conscious of what cultural appropriation is, because I think in a lot of cases, many people don't know what that is. And brands sometimes maybe feel that they're paying homage, but, you know, erasing the actual people who develop this particular, you know, cultural style, that, you know, that shouldn't be the case. So I think, it's around, it is.
It's interesting, because what strikes me here and what you're saying, and also in the question, is that with the cultural appropriation often comes in when brands are playing to the dominant narrative.
Yes.
But when brands play more to the emergent narrative, which to me, from what you've said, Jennifer, sounds like the narrative that groups themselves want to be portrayed, then that's the more authentic, and that's actually the richer place to play in. So it's about how do you keep up with the emergent almost, and how do you make sure that you are in that space rather than in the dominant space, and move that forward.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, 100%. Because, and so what, yeah, and I think you made a good point there. It is understanding which brands are doing it well and how, and not necessarily copying it, but understanding what they are doing. And that involves kind of like, you know, cultural insight and understanding like what communities actually want to see, and these ideas of more accurate and realistic depictions, like how is that coming out, you know, in conversations and in the comms you communicate. And so, and I think, yeah, cultural insight helps with that, with clarifying that.
And so there's one more question from Mercy here. So you gave at the end a few tips. I guess this is a slightly more directed question. So what can brands and production teams do to ensure that dark-skinned women and representation of them is portrayed more frequently, but also in an authentic way? How can people go about that?
Yeah, so let's see. Showcasing to ensure there's not portrayed, but also, yeah, in an authentic manner. Let's see. So I would say two things. One is understanding those communities, and sometimes that means that, well, speaking to them first of all, and so speaking to those communities, understanding their experiences, so that you are, you know, understanding the nuances of those experiences so that they can be accurately represented. That's one. And two, having those people in the decision-making, you know, in the room to actually advise on it, to, you know, suggest different ideas, suggest ideas that are relevant. I think there is, you know, and I know I had a conversation, a colleague around this, and around diversity being kind of always, in a sense, spotlighted as a problem. So this is a problem that we need to fix, right? As opposed to a solution. So it is not going to harm you, or it's not going to negatively impact you if you have, you know, these individuals in the room actually developing, you know, your brand and these representations with you. Because, you know, McKinsey has shown that having a diverse staff leads to more robust ideas and more, you know, and more profit in general for brands. So I think if you do want to showcase these communities authentically, you also have to have them in the room as well.
In the room,
so,
yeah. It's fascinating, because in some of the work that we do when we consult with brands and bring people into the room through workshops and through our consultancy, we find in moving it forward and assuming that diversity and inclusion is not a zero-sum game. Everyone stands to gain. And if brands are pushing on the emergent, actually the threat in society is more that the society's in that dominant phase still. So you showed the Sainsbury's advert, and actually very authentic portrayal,
definitely
got a lot of backlash, because for many people what it did, and actually through what I've learned from what you've said today, is it challenged people out of what they knew the dominant was, and shown them a different portrayal of what blackness, what black joy can look like,
definitely,
which then moves society on, which I guess is the beauty, and hopefully the gift of everybody who's attended this today. So with a few minutes ago, I'm going to hand back to Ollie in a second. Alice has just got in there with a final question, which is any tips for staying up to date with dominant versus emerging narratives. I'll do a bit of a shameless plug there, Alice. If you go to the unmistakeables.com and sign up for our newsletter, we have a fortnightly newsletter where we send out some trends around that. But Jennifer, any resources or places to direct Alice?
So what I would suggest is looking at brands that are at the leading edge of culture. They would be the first to kind of do these emergent articulations. So they may not be in the mainstream yet, but they could set, you know, the pace, and, you know, they're plugged into kind of consumers. So for instance, like Fenty, for instance, is a good brand to look at. So, Savage Fenty. And so they're active on social media, and they don't take a one size fit all approach to kind of beauty and skin color. And look at, publications that highlight the experiences of, marginalized communities. They're doing a lot of emergent stuff.
Great. Well, I did say I would hand over to Ollie, but Rupert got in there with a really good question, so I do want to ask it, and then I will hand back to Ollie.
Yes, Galdem is excellent, and Burnt Roti.
Burnt Roti is a great one by Sharon Dhaliwal. That's a great one. So the final question from Rupert. So as researchers, we typically research advertising in groups comprising of a mix of people in terms of race, ethnicity. In your view, Jennifer, are the issues that you're talking about that say non-Black audiences can have a valuable view on, or are these things that can only be discussed by ethnic audiences and indeed only by ethnic researchers?
That's an interesting question. And also, I'd like to hear your response to that too, because I know you're in that space and you advise a lot of brands and corporations. So yeah.
Yeah, well, my point of view on that, to give you an example, Rupert, we did some research around South Asian women, for example, and actually for some older South Asian women, language can be quite a big barrier. So we found that when, this was a qual piece of research, so when they were speaking to other South Asian women of a similar age, they were able to lean on different language cues and different cultural cues that gave deeper insight. Now, that's not to say that within the mix of the researchers, you should only have the group that you're researching, because then you don't get any diversity that way. But sometimes you are able to shortcut or see things when you've got people from the group that you're researching. And I think what we've definitely done in our development of Inside Outsides, which is our research division at the Unmistakeables, is think about how do you remove the othering that research can create to say there's not a group over there that feels like you're looking at them through your glass box. It's actually people that you've got in the room who are helping develop it together. So I don't think, for me, the answer wouldn't be it should only be ethnic researchers researching ethnic audiences, but a mix and understanding what cultural cues you can lean on in that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. I think with that, Ollie's back on screen, so I'll hand back over to you. But Jennifer, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to hear your presentation and ask you these questions today.
No problem. Same. Thank you.
It's been a massive pleasure for all of us. That was a fantastic presentation and a fantastic conversation by, Jennifer, you've clearly prepared that incredibly well and looked into it in a great lot of depth. And the conversation between the two of you afterwards is wonderful for all of us to hear. So I would like to do a big old round of applause and pretend that you're in the room, and everyone give them a big round of applause, because this would have been done in person with people there and you would have heard the round of applause. So massive virtual round of applause to both of you. Thank you so much. I'm slightly speechless. I don't really know how to describe it. I'm going to say thank you again. I do have to do a minor piece of housekeeping, which is to announce that we actually have a massively packed agenda of other events coming up. So please, folk at the AQR, do take note. There is another webinar next week called The Making of History with Professor Claire Langemer, discussing modern British history with Phyllis McFarlane, and particularly how qualitative research can bring out the history of the past and make it relevant for today. That's on the 17th. On the 19th, that's next Monday, on the 19th, we have an AQR check-in. I know a lot of people have been joining those. It's great for us all to just have an open discussion about what's going on in the industry. We have a course on AQR Quant for Qualies. So for those qualies who feel a bit bamboozled by the numbers, that is a brilliant one. It is pretty much fully booked, but there may be waiting list places, so please do join. And that's on the 20th of May. And then quite an important masterclass coming up in June, a 3-part one called Managing the Hybrid series. So the hybrid is obviously the new popular word in research and elsewhere. So let's figure out how we can manage that from a research perspective, but also from a leadership perspective as well, to try and figure that part out. And then we have our AGM, the AQR's AGM on the 30th of June as well, which is always entertaining and fun, but you will also get the results of the new board members. So we are and the election for that will be coming out very soon. So there's lots going on at the AQR. Please do have a look at the calendar on the AQR website. But I'd have to say that today's webinar was a massive highlight in this series. So thank you both once again, and I hope to see you again soon. Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining, everyone. Thanks, Asad.